the moment, if I was a Kremlin decision maker, I would think, well, I have huge advantage over the European NATO countries, and particularly if America's going to be wobbly or distracted, and I can hammer them with hundreds and hundreds of strikes on population centres, on critical national infrastructure, on military and intelligence targets, and they won't be able to do very much about it. And I will, and that gives me the edge if it should come to a fight. And that's a very uncomfortable position for European NATO to be in. What we want is for Russia to think there's no point in us picking a fight with NATO. They're much bigger and stronger than us, and they'll smash us.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Edward Lucas, Times columnist and European security expert with a special focus on Russian foreign policy. And Edward is very much a friend of the show. Edward, welcome.
Great to be here.
Well, the US pause in munitions for Ukraine appears to be continuing. It's not clear how long that's going to go on for. But what do we know about this pause and how damaging it could become for Ukraine?
What seems to be emerging right now is how much this was the personal decision of Elbridge Colby, the policy chief at the Pentagon. It doesn't seem to have been consulted with the State Department or what's left of the National Security Council or the White House. And so Colby's looking a bit exposed here, which creates at least the chance of some sort of back down, coupled, of course, with the reasonably friendly phone call that President Zelensky had with President Trump in the attempt to push back on that. So I think the big picture is that it's a serious strategic vulnerability for Ukraine if its air defences are exhausted. They're not exhausted yet, but they are running out, and any slowdown in American supplies is very unwelcome from that point of view.
So you mentioned that phone call that President Zelensky had with Donald Trump late last week. There was also another call with Putin in which Trump expressed a level of dismay with the way Russia are carrying on with these strikes. Do you think that Ukraine can take some extra confidence that Trump is warming up a bit more to President Zelensky?
I'm very cautious about too much wishful thinking on this, and it's true that Trump has not cut Ukraine completely adrift. So the worst fears from the campaign and from the after the disastrous meeting in the Oval Office haven't been realised. But on the other hand, there's no sign of Trump putting any real pressure on Putin. He said that he thinks Putin's misguided. He was asked at the NATO summit at the press conference whether he would characterise Putin as an enemy, and he said no, he explicitly refused to do that. So I feel that we are kind of breathing rather thin air here. And the real point is that the Europeans have got to stop hoping that America will step in and just get on and fill the gap. And I don't feel that that's happening at the moment. So there's rather too much attention on what Trump did or didn't say today and what he may or may not have talked about to Putin. Those are words. Let's focus on deeds.
Yeah, and how much does this reflect a wider concern, I suppose, for especially Ukraine, but also Europe, when the message of support from the president, Donald Trump, says one thing, but the actions of the administration are so different?
Yes, it's like rather sort of strange modern music, which is in both a major and a minor key at the same time. So we have the sort of seemingly cheerful, upbeat arpeggios from The Hague, with Trump saying that NATO is a great institution and wow, these people really love their country, coupled with serious worries about the long-term future of the American military presence in Europe and this cut-off of at least some aid to Ukraine done at perplexingly short notice. And I just think we've got to stop this European, it's the opposite of navel gazing, it's gazing at the far horizon across the Atlantic and thinking when are the white ships coming from America to save us from our security problems. And we've got to get on and sort it out ourselves. Now, we can't provide Ukraine with everything it needs from the United States, but we can supply other things. So what about a big shipment of Taurus missiles from the Germans, for example? If Ukraine can, or a lot of money to go into Ukraine's defence industry to build up even further its long-range strike capability. In the end, air defence is a mixture of shooting down the other side's missiles when they're in midair, and what's much better is destroying the launching sites and the factories that make them and creating a sort of deterrent where the other side thinks it's not worth hitting Kiev with 500 drones and rockets because Kiev will hit that with 1,000 against Moscow. That's what we've got to restore, is that sort of deterrence balance. And Ukraine can't do it on its own. And that, but with the Europeans' help, it could. And that's what's so frustrating about this endless discussion about of the sort of willy won't from the Americans.
And of course, it's a very real and quite serious immediate threat for Ukraine and for Kiev. Russia is launching near nightly record amounts of drones and missiles at Ukrainian cities. How severe is that situation becoming now?
Well, it's getting worse. I saw someone quoted in The Economist saying that Ukraine was being roasted over a slow fire, and it must feel like that for people who live in the big cities that are being hit. I do think it's worth remembering that Ukraine is a very big country, and there's an awful lot of Ukraine that has never suffered a single drone or missile strike, and not only because it's countryside, but there are small towns and villages and even bigger cities that have been largely or completely spared because it's such a big place. I think the human footprint of the war is actually much bigger than the physical destruction. And every Ukrainian I know, I think every Ukrainian will have someone a close family member or friend who's been either killed or wounded at the front. So that's a bigger footprint than the destruction of the cities. But it takes its toll. There's no sign at the moment of Ukrainian willingness to keep fighting eroding, although there does seem to be intensifying political pressure around Zelensky and the increasing dissatisfaction with his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. Again, this was reported in this week's Economist. And I think that the political sort of bargain of shut up and back the team in charge, which was struck at the beginning of the war, is beginning to fray. I don't think that has any direct effect on Ukraine's willingness to keep in the fight. But if you put it all together, if you have internal political discord, a feeling that the Americans are not going to help and cutting off aid, that the Europeans talk but don't do, and the Russians advancing slowly on the front, and night after night devastation raining down on the cities, that all combined could have an effect in the course of this year. So I think the key thing for the Europeans is keep Ukraine going, give them hope, and wait for the Russian problems to bite, which they will do next year. And that, I think, gives a sort of coherent strategic outlook. But it does require the Europeans to increase their appetite for risk and to dip their hands deeper into their pockets.
And you've been writing in your column this week that threat of Russian missile production is far wider than just Ukraine. I mean, how worried should we be about the amounts of missiles that Russia are able to produce now?
Well, we should be very worried about this. And I should say two things. First of all, this is my Times column. This is my weekly column for my think tank in Washington, CEPA. And it's you can see all my columns there at CEPA, CEPA.org. And what I've done in this column is, it's always a columnist's dream when someone else comes out with some great research that you can publicise. There's a brilliant young German academic based in Oslo called Fabian Hoffmann, who has a weekly newsletter called Missile Matters. And what he's shown in this missile, basically in this salvo of facts about missiles, is that the Europeans are not able to produce interceptors on the scale, at the speed at which Russia is producing ballistic missiles. So just be clear about the terms here. We're not talking here about drones, and we're not talking here about these sort of slow cruise missiles. These are fast missiles like the Hinjar, or the one that's launched from the Iskander system, and they go very fast. They're ballistic missiles. So for those listeners whose frame of reference is World War II, these are the V2s, not the V1s. And Russia's cranking up production to these well into the high hundreds, perhaps 800 or 900 a year. And the total production of the two kinds of interceptors, the ones for the French-Italian system, the SMPT, and the better-known American Patriot system, is not enough to deal with that. It's roughly also about 800, but not all those interceptors can be used in Europe. A lot of them are needed by other countries, not least the United States or Japan or whoever. And secondly, it's not one for one. It doesn't take one interceptor to shoot down one missile. It takes two or even three. And so the upshot of Fabian Hoffmann's research is that in the event of a Russian attack on European NATO countries, roughly 2/3 of the Russian ballistic missiles would get through. Drones and other missiles is a separate story. But the key thing is there's no chance of closing that gap quickly. Yet, although we're ramping up production, we're going to be nowhere near meeting that by the end of the decade. And that means that any doctrine of defending ourselves in European NATO against Russia purely through air and missile defence is hopeless. The maths just don't add up. And that means that we'll need to rethink our deterrence and have a powerful counter-strike capability in order to deter Russia. And that, of course, requires factories to make missiles, which we don't yet have, and also decision makers who are able to deploy that deterrent and deploy it credibly. And I'm not sure we have those either.
And so, what are those alternatives? And is it only having an offensive response capability as well? And is part of the problem here the fact that you mentioned there seem to be only really these two air defense systems we have at the moment that can deal with these missiles? The US Patriot, which, as we've discussed, it's got to come from America, which may not be the most reliable supplier at the moment, and then the SAMP/T, which I believe you say is French-Italian. I mean, could Europe develop new versions of these missiles, or something similar, or more simple, or is it really just about having an offensive capability?
Well, these are several separate questions. So first of all, the Patriot is also made outside the United States under license, but there's just as, according to Hoffman, and I think he's right, we cannot scale up production of the interceptors anywhere near where we need. Russia's increasing all the time. We would need to increase in I think at an impossible level. So we're not going to do it with interceptors. We certainly can't develop a new system in the time available, because that would be take even longer. So that means we are reliant then on deterrence, and that means boosting our capabilities for long-range fires, so that Russia thinks, yes, sure, we could get through with our missiles and hit a lot of European targets, but they would get through with even more of their missiles and hit ours. And then you've got a kind of balance of terror. I should add that there are promising technological developments on the horizon. So there could be laser-based weapons for shooting down ballistic missiles. We don't have them yet, but that's theoretically possible. And there's also a lot of work happening on the defence systems that can shoot down drones. There's an excellent new Estonia-based or Estonian-founded company, Frankenberg, which is producing very, very cheap anti-drone rockets. And put very crudely, it's like a sort of hand grenade steered by an iPhone put on the cheapest possible rocket. And that is very promising. So we may have an answer to the drone swarms much sooner than we think, but that doesn't mean we have an answer to the ballistic missiles, which are going really fast, and they go up, come down again, giving you very little warning, and we've seen what damage they can do in Ukraine. So that's what we need an answer to, and we don't have it. We don't have it yet, and we need it urgently.
And is there anything to be learned from Ukraine here? And we've seen Ukraine continuing its own drone campaign, hitting a Russian airfield in Borsogledsk on Saturday, attempting to hit another in Crimea on Sunday. Is there something we could learn from the way Ukraine has adapted to hit Russia without its own kind of significant air power?
Well, I think the good lesson from Ukraine is that you can innovate far faster than you think when you face an existential threat. A second lesson is that Ukraine would be even more effective if they had more money. But a third and less promising or encouraging lesson is that despite Ukraine's ability to hit deep inside Russia and hard inside Russia, it hasn't yet created much of a deterrent. You might think that having dozens of very expensive planes disabled and serious attacks, on Russian cities and all this, that this might give the Russians pause. It doesn't seem to be. So whatever Ukraine's doing, it's not enough, because the attacks on Ukraine are continuing. And I think that Russia still feels that in this, in the war of attrition happening over the air, or through the air, they have the advantage, just as they have the advantage in the war of attrition on the ground. Where they don't have an advantage is the war of attrition on the sea. That's where the Ukrainians have been ahead, but sadly that's not enough to tip the tide of the war.
So what is the message then, you think all European leaders, especially politically, should be thinking about when they're facing this Russian missile threat?
Well, first of all, to acknowledge that it's there, and at the moment most Europeans sleep peacefully in their beds thinking that their country must have some sort of Israeli-style layered air defence, and actually it doesn't. We have air defences over a few military bases like Ramstein, but that's the first thing, is public awareness. Secondly, politicians will need to prioritise and say, okay, we have very limited air defences. What are we going to protect? So obviously, Rotterdam really matters, because that's where we would get any putative American reinforcement through. Bremerhaven matters. Perhaps Amsterdam, not so important. That's going to be politically tricky, to put it very mildly. But they're the difficult decisions. And then the most importantly, the politicians have got to think, where do we get some more bang for our buck? What can we do quickly to develop the kind of long-range counter-strike capability that will make the Russians think that this isn't the way to kick off a war? And at the moment, if I was a Kremlin decision maker, I would think, well, I have huge advantage over the European NATO countries, and particularly if America's going to be wobbly or distracted, and I can hammer them with hundreds and hundreds of strikes on population centres, on critical national infrastructure, on military and intelligence targets, and they won't be able to do very much about it. And I will, and that gives me the edge if it should come to a fight. And that's a very uncomfortable position for European NATO to be in. What we want is for Russia to think there's no point in us picking a fight with NATO. They're much bigger and stronger than us, and they'll smash us. I don't think that's the image we're projecting at the moment.
Well, on a slightly separate topic there, but still on what is going on in the mindsets inside the Kremlin, the Institute for the Study of War is reporting that Putin has stepped up his own drive to encourage further recruitment of Russian soldiers, possibly in response to recruitment online dropping in Russia. The Kremlin's always claiming that it can fight this long-term war. It'll just go on forever and ever, and it will outlast Europe. But is that really true? And do they have the manpower and capabilities to do that?
I think that, again, we have to be very careful about wishful thinking. We've been, since the start of the war, people have been saying we're going to reach a sort of 1917 moment where the Russian troops are so badly supplied and demoralised and badly led that they're going to start just walking home, and the whole, the front will collapse and Russia with it. I don't exclude that in the long run, but there's no sign of it yet, and we can't pin our hopes on that. I think that Russia uses whatever's cheapest. And when soldiers are cheap, they use that. When stocks of old Soviet equipment are cheap, they use that. When North Koreans are cheap, they use those. And you as a military planner, you go for the cheapest and most plentiful resource that you have that will get the job done. And for now, they're using conscripts and paid for soldiers, and using them in large numbers, and many of them being maimed and killed. We won't know exactly how many in future, because the Russians are halting casualty rate reporting. But I would advise listeners and viewers to this not to assume that Russia just gives up because one factor of war production runs out. If they stop, we've already seen that they can't use armored vehicles anymore, so they use motorbikes and motor scooters. I think if they are running short of soldiers, they will find other things. We may see even more use of drones, or we may see more use of foreign volunteers. I saw a report the other day, I think unconfirmed, that they were getting demining capabilities from Laos. And there are plenty of other countries around the world with young men who, with whatever incentive or through whatever deception, may end up on the front lines. So please don't assume that Russia's going to be done for. There are problems, particularly on the economic front, And so it's well worth intensifying the squeeze on that. And it's absolutely worth it giving more money and more weapons to Ukraine. But don't just assume that Russia will exhaust itself.
And we've talked a lot today, Edward, about how Russia really has found itself now in a relatively advantageous position, at least to where it was perhaps a year ago. Um, does that leave any hope for these peace talks that Donald Trump had been pushing for? We know they're ongoing and there are prisoner swaps going on, but does this leave Russia in a position to really let anything more substantial happen in those talks?
Well, I think at the moment Russia has the initiative. It has the military initiative, and it can decide where to push Ukraine and how. On the front, it can decide the timing and scale and targets of its air offensives. And it's got the diplomatic initiative. And I wish they didn't. I wish that Putin woke up every morning thinking, golly, what, or perhaps even a stronger expletive, what's the West going to do to me today? But he doesn't. And so we therefore have to think quite hard about what Russia can do with that initiative. It can continue pressing forward. They could, if they wanted, declare a ceasefire. That would catch us all by surprise. It could be a messy ceasefire with no conditions, no outside scrutiny. They could then start fighting again whenever they wanted, and that would be disorienting and difficult. They could switch to another target for a bit. So I think that we are, at the moment, it's a bit like a game of tennis where Russia's serving, to use a Wimbledon analogy as well in the week of Wimbledon. And we've let that happen. Don't forget that we were being pushed around by a country the size, with an economy the size of Italy. And that is the most enormous geopolitical, geoeconomic, geofinancial, geostrategic failure by the West, which is so much bigger and stronger than Russia.
And we talk about the geostrategy and the economics there. There is an upcoming BRICS summit, which is going to be in Brazil. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that economic alliance of sorts. Putin's not going to be able to attend that summit, though, because, of course, he has that warrant out for his arrest. Where does that leave the Russians in this alliance and this summit as well?
I think that we tend to overestimate the internal cohesion of the BRICS group. A lot of things they've talked about, whether it's customs union or common currencies or coordinated diplomacy, haven't really happened. And we see with the South Africans' desperate attempt to befriend the Americans and repair the damage they've done with their anti-Trump and anti-Israel stance, that there are quite severe costs to being very anti-American. And it's also noteworthy that India's anything but anti-American at the moment. Modi seems quite happy to try and keep cordial relations with Trump. So I think there's not much internal cohesion. There's a series of marriages of convenience, of which by far the most important is the Russian-Chinese marriage of convenience. The Indians and Chinese basically detest each other. South Africa doesn't really matter. Some of the other countries that are involved in BRICS, like the Egyptians, are not turning up. Iran is not turning up. So you've got a sort of loose network of anti-countries that are, to some or other extent, anti-Western, and who enjoy the showcasing and showboating of a summit when it's convenient. But there's not much substance there compared with something like, even compared with ASEAN or with, certainly not with the European Union. So I think the BRICS summit will be one to watch, but I don't think it's going to be giving many sleepless nights, particularly with Xi not coming, Sisi not coming, the Iranian president not coming, Putin not coming. So I think just a watching brief on that one.
And we've also heard from Chinese officials that Beijing will not let Russia lose the war in Ukraine. It's quite a contrast, really, because it seems that there's a lot more joined up thinking going on among Russia's allies, or the Crinks alliance, if you will, than there is in NATO.
I wouldn't say there's a lot more. I mean, the European NATO allies do have a pretty well-developed framework for getting stuff to Ukraine, and there's a complex multinational supply chain which still does a pretty good job of getting the stuff that's been agreed there, and there are, and I think that the level of sort of emotional engagement that you see from NATO countries in Ukraine's resistance far outstrips anything you see in China or North Korea. I think the Chinese decision makers don't want Russia to lose, and they see there's some advantage in having the Ukraine conflict keeping the Americans a bit distracted, and they might want the Americans more distracted if they're going to try anything in Taiwan. That's what Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, worries about. Things kick off in the Western Pacific, and Putin then does Xi a favour by creating some sort of distraction in Europe. But I don't think this is it's pretty opportunistic and pretty spasmodic, with the exception of Chinese help in Russian sanctions busting and the Chinese help to the Russian supply chain, which is substantial. But that's not on the basis of affection. It's yet again a marriage of convenience.
Where does that leave China and Russia's geopolitical objectives on the world stage then? And what does it say about the general global security conditions we find ourselves in?
I think that the big story is that the centre of economic and political diplomatic gravity in the world is shifting south. And seen from the countries that have most of the world's population, the war in Ukraine looks like a sort of, as one African diplomat said, just one lot of white people killing another lot of white people. They've been doing it for centuries and they'll continue to do it for centuries, and I don't see why it's our business, thus parodying the sort of dismissive attitude that European countries used to have to terrible conflicts in Africa. And when you look at things like the Gulf Cooperation Council and their meeting with their summit with ASEAN, or the BRICS summit, or any of the other sorts of things that are going on, African Union and so on, you do see that there's an awful lot of economic growth out there. There's an awful lot of people. There's an awful lot of concern with the big problems the world's facing, such as climate change and the energy transition, and an awful lot of impatience with the very weak policymaking and very limited vision of the Old West. And when you see something like the NATO summit producing a sort of the skinniest ever communique of 5 paragraphs, because Trump's attention span won't stretch to anything longer, and the sort of Trump leaving the G7 early because he gets bored or fed up, and the floundering efforts of the European Union to get to grips with its own economic stagnation and other things, it doesn't look terribly impressive from the rest of the world. And I think we, and the listeners and viewers who are in the Old West, have probably grown up with the idea that we are the people who know how to do economics and politics and diplomacy, and the rest of the world rather looks up for us and wants leadership from us. And that was true maybe back in the 90s and the noughties. It's not really true now in the 2020s. We're seen as a squabbling, ineffective, economically stagnant, self-obsessed, and that is providing an awful lot of room, whether it's from the Chinese Communist Party pushing its development model, or just groups of other countries, Brazil, Indonesia, the Gulf countries, or whoever, Kenya, Nigeria, who just say, look, just get out of the way and let us get on with trying to do our stuff, stop preaching, stop interfering. So that era of global leadership of the West is really over and collapsing much faster than people think. And I don't think that our leaders or our public have quite appreciated how rapid that process is.
Well, Edward Lucas, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you very much, Lee, for your excellent questions.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.